They said love was unconditional until he came out. Julian Marshall never asked to be special. He just wanted to belong. As a boy with curious eyes and a quiet voice, he spent his early childhood nestled in the warmth of Sunday sermons and front porch dinners, believing he was a blessing sent from above. He had been adopted by Robert and Elaine Marshall, a couple known in their Texas town for leading prayers louder than their silence at home. Robert, a local pastor, often told his congregation that faith could rebuild any broken soul. For a time, Julian believed that, because back then, Robert smiled at him. Elaine read him stories at night, and on Christmas, Julian's stocking hung beside theirs, stitched with his name like it had always belonged there. But everything shifted when Elaine gave birth. Suddenly, the house grew louder with cries that weren't his, and quieter in ways that pierced deeper than sound. Julian, once called their miracle, became a shadow. Meals became more distant. Hugs grew formal, almost rehearsed. The toys he once shared with Robert in the garage collected dust, untouched. He was still in their home, but no longer in their hearts. Julian tried. He painted Mother's Day cards, learned hymns by heart, and smiled every time his younger sibling stumbled into attention. But by the time he was a teenager, he understood. He was not the son they prayed for. He was the one they felt obligated to keep. The final crack came on a humid summer evening. Julian had just turned 17. His hands shook as he placed a note on the dinner table. A simple truth. "I'm gay." Robert read it aloud. The room stilled. Then, without hesitation, the man who once called him son stood and struck him across the face. "You will not speak of this filth in the house of Gwyn," he said, voice trembling, not from sorrow but disgust. Elaine said nothing. The siblings he had watched grow up with quiet admiration kept their eyes on their plates. Nobody followed when Julian left the table. Nobody asked where he was going. Nobody asked if he'd eaten. That night, he packed a small suitcase half empty and closed the door without a goodbye. Elaine met him outside, her eyes hollow, hands cold. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say anything at all. But she handed him an envelope. Inside was $200, folded flat, silent, like everything else. He walked into the night as if walking off a stage that was never built for him. No applause, no curtain call, just the echo of rejection still ringing in his ears. Years later, when people asked where he came from, he'd say Texas. But in truth, Julian came from silence. From a house that preached grace yet forgot how to offer it. From a man who held a Bible tighter than his child's hand. From a mother who once called him angel but never looked back. And in that silence, Julian made a vow not to fight for their love again, but to build a life that made theirs irrelevant. Because sometimes, family isn't blood. It's the fire you keep alive after they try to put it out. To hear the next part of Julian's journey, follow us on Heartstorie, where the stories they tried to erase are finally heard. Julian Marshall walked away from the only home he had ever known, but there was no destination waiting. Just the sound of traffic, the heaviness of the Texas night, and the weight of being unwanted. College was no longer an option. Without support, without a safety net, he took the first job that would pay him in cash washing dishes in a small roadside diner that smelled of grease and sorrow. By day, he scrubbed pans and wiped tables. By night, he pedaled his bike to deliver takeout across a city that never looked back. There were no dreams now, only survival. But something stirred in him each time he passed the public library. It became a place he returned to. Not out of comfort, but curiosity. Julian would sit in the back corner, headphones in, watching free coding tutorials on outdated desktops. At first, the language of computers felt as foreign as the home he had left behind, but it was logical, clear. If you got the syntax right, it worked. There were no hidden rules. No need to apologize for who you were. One evening, he spilled coffee on an old keyboard and nearly left in shame, but the man next to him, broad-shouldered, kind eyes, with a faded university hoodie, smiled and handed him a napkin. His name was Carlos. He was studying renewable energy. passionate about sustainability, and had dreams of a world where technology could power compassion. Their connection wasn't sudden, but steady. Over weeks of quiet glances and shared seats, Carlos became the first person in years to call Julian brilliant. Not broken, not lost, just brilliant. They spent nights talking beneath broken streetlights, sketching ideas on napkins, dreaming of a software that could help buildings use energy more efficiently. Not because they had the answers, but because they believed someone needed to try. With nothing but Carlos's old laptop and a folding table from the thrift store, they launched a small startup in the corner of a borrowed garage. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't funded, but it was theirs. The days blurred into nights. They wrote code until their eyes stung, pitched their idea to anyone who'd listen, and faced rejection more times than they could count. But every setback was a reminder this was their road now. Then came the turning point. A local competition called Startup Zone A National Challenge for Green Innovation offered a spotlight they never expected. With nothing to lose, they submitted their prototype. Julian presented, nerves masked by calm. When the results came in, their project had not only placed, it had won. The prize wasn't just recognition, it was a seed fund of $1 million. The judges called their solution disruptive. Investors saw vision, but Julian felt something deeper: proof. Proof that he was never the mistake they claimed. Proof that purpose could grow from rejection. As the company expanded, so did their lives. They moved from the garage to an actual office, hired a team, signed contracts with the green developers. But Julian never forgot the nights he coded with empty pockets and borrowed Wi-Fi. He still walked by the church he once sat in every Sunday, still remembered the feel of his father's hand, not when it held him, but when it struck him. But now his hands were building something else, something sacred. Not for God, not for approval, but for those still wandering, still walking, still hoping someone would see them and say, "You matter. You always did." To hear what Julian did next with his success, follow us on Heartstorie, where silence ends and truth begins. Success looked different when it had once seemed impossible. Julian Marshall now stood at the helm of a thriving tech company, an enterprise born from second-hand code and sleepless nights. The product they once tested in coffee shops had been adopted by real estate developers across the state. Their name appeared in clean energy conferences, in green business journals, in the conversations of people who once would have ignored a boy like him. Still, there was a part of Julian that remained untouched by all of it, because the deeper the world applauded him, the louder the silence from his past became. Robert Marshall had never reached out. Not after the company launched, not after the news articles, not even when Julian's face appeared on a billboard downtown beside the words, "Innovation for a Cleaner Tomorrow." There were no phone calls, no letters, just the same deliberate absence. But Julian couldn't forget what it was to be a son, even if he no longer was one in their eyes. So he made a decision. With the help of his attorney, he purchased a beachfront property near Galveston. The house was stunning glass walls, open air, nestled between quiet waves and the hush of private shoreline. $5 million in value, and he signed it over, in full, to Robert and Elaine Marshall. No letter, no explanation, just a deed and a legal envelope, quietly delivered. It was not an act of forgiveness. It was something quieter than that. Perhaps closure, perhaps a silent thank you for the roof they once gave him, however fragile. Then came the day that would test the edges of his restraint. Robert Marshall's 70th birthday. Julian was not invited, but he went anyway. He dressed simply, no entourage, no announcement, just one envelope in his jacket containing the official documents of his property transfer. He arrived at the event, a manicured garden party filled with local politicians, church elders, and family members he hadn't seen in over a decade. Conversations froze when they saw him. No one stepped forward. No one asked why he came. Still, Julian waited. He watched his siblings smile for photos. He watched his mother hold her wine glass just tightly enough to tremble. He watched Robert bask in attention as if he had never turned a child away. And then came the moment. Robert stepped forward, clearing his throat. With a voice still heavy with pride, he announced a new will. "Everything I've built, every piece of it, will pass to my children," he said, pausing just long enough to scan the crowd. "My children by blood." Then his eyes locked with Julian's, and the next words fell like lead. "We tried to love Julian, but some things, some choices, God simply cannot bless, and we will not pretend otherwise in his house or in our home." No gasp followed, just silence, the kind that wraps around a soul and tells it to sit back down. Julian did not speak. He reached into his jacket, lifted the envelope, the deed to the beach house, and held it high. A few heads turned, a few breaths caught. Then, slowly, deliberately, he tore the papers in half, then again, until there was nothing but shredded proof that he had once tried. He left before anyone could stop him, before anyone could ask why. No one called after him. No one followed. And as he stepped out of that garden of strangers, he knew this was the last time he would answer to the name Marshall. He would not beg to belong again. He would not offer gifts to those who called him sin. He would start again, this time as Julian Harper, the name of his birth mother, whom he had quietly found during the search for something older than shame. Because if the past could not accept him, then it did not deserve to carry his name forward. To see how Julian reclaimed that legacy, follow us on Heartstorie, where strength grows from the roots they tried to cut. Julian Harper signed the name for the first time a week after tearing up the deed. The courthouse was quiet that morning. No press, no audience. Just a clerk who glanced at the papers, nodded, and asked, "New legal surname?" He answered without hesitation. "Not Marshall, not anymore, Harper." There was no ceremony, no final goodbye to the past. Only the silent click of a pen and the soft imprint of his fingerprint beside the name of a woman he'd never met, but somehow always carried inside him. Julian didn't speak of the birthday party again. Not to Carlos, not to his team. He deleted the photos he had taken on the way there, removed the beach house listing, asked his assistant to redirect any family-related correspondence to a closed folder he would never open. He wasn't angry. He was finished. Months passed, and Julian poured himself into the work again. The company expanded, launching energy optimization tools for hospitals and schools across the country. Clients referred to him as visionary. Interviews called him brilliant. But none of those words meant as much as what he felt each time someone stepped into their office and said, "You made this space feel safe," because that was all he had ever wanted. A place where being different wasn't a flaw, but a feature. 1 year later, he was invited to speak at a national sustainability conference in Chicago. Thousands attended. The keynote was broadcast live. Julian stood beneath warm lights in a tailored navy suit. No rainbow pin, no mention of the years he spent in silence. But his presence alone carried the weight of every wound. He spoke of clean energy, of innovation through empathy, of technology designed not just to work, but to care. And then, at the end, without a name, without context, he told the truth in the only way that mattered. "I used to think survival meant proving I was good enough for the people who left me behind. But I learned that legacy isn't built from their approval. It's built from presence, from showing up, even when they tried to erase you. I am not the son they remember. I am the son I chose to become. I am the child of resilience. And the man I love is not my shame, but my compass." He left the stage to a standing ovation. But applause was never the point. The point was that no one could ever take that moment from him. Later that night, Julian sat by his hotel window, watching the quiet skyline reflect off Lake Michigan. He thought about Robert, about the silence that followed his final exit, about how no apology had come, and how, surprisingly, he didn't need one anymore. Because closure doesn't always arrive wrapped in the words we hope for. Sometimes it comes when we realize we've already walked beyond the pain. He reached into his bag and pulled out a photograph, a copy of the only picture he had of his birth mother. taken from her high school yearbook. Her eyes were kind, her smile uneven. Julian looked at her and whispered softly, "I hope you would have been proud. Not as a tech CEO, not as a speaker, but as a man who finally stood tall, not in defiance, but in peace." To hear how Julian passed that peace on to someone else, follow us on Heartstorie, where courage creates the families we never had. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope. It had no return address, just a simple header, Harper Shelter Grant Application. Julian Harper read through it as the morning sun poured into his downtown Austin office. The application was from a 13-year-old boy in Georgia named Ethan. The handwriting was uneven, a mix of capital letters and careful lines, like someone afraid of saying too much. In it, Ethan explained that he had been removed from his home after telling his parents he had feelings for a boy in his class. His father called it a phase. His mother cried and told him to leave. A school counselor helped him find temporary housing. A caseworker told him about Harper Shelter. Julian didn't need to finish the application to know Ethan would be accepted. The foundation had started quietly. Just a side initiative at first, a way for Julian to channel the success of his company into something permanent. Harper Shelter wasn't just about housing. It was about restoring dignity. It offered scholarships, mentorships, safe dormitories, and the one thing no system could guarantee: someone who cared. Julian rarely met the applicants. He preferred to stay in the background, letting the team handle logistics. But something about Ethan's letter made him pause. He asked to meet the boy in person. They arranged a visit at the shelter's regional center. Ethan stood waiting in the garden courtyard, wearing a too large hoodie and clutching a book to his chest. His eyes were sharp, cautious, the way only kids who had been forced to grow up too fast could carry. They talked about books, then science, then the future. Julian didn't press. He didn't need to. But just as he was about to leave, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded, photo-creased, faded. "My mom used to show me this when I was little," Ethan said. "Said it was my grandfather, but no one ever talked about him." Julian looked down at the image. It was a younger Robert Marshall, standing in front of the same church that once told Julian he didn't belong. He felt his breath catch. "You're Robert's grandson?" he asked, the words leaving before he could contain them. Ethan nodded. "Mom said he didn't want anything to do with her. She had me when she was really young. Never told him. Said he wouldn't understand." Julian stared at the boy. The same last name, the same quiet fire behind his eyes, the same need for a place to land. And suddenly, everything made sense. Robert had erased Julian. Yet in some silent twist of fate, the legacy he tried to destroy had looped back, not through bloodlines or inheritance, but through healing. Through Ethan. Julian didn't tell him everything. He didn't need to say he had once lived in that house, had once stood at that dinner table, had once tried to offer a gift that was never received. Instead, he placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder and said, "You're safe now, and you're not alone." That night, Julian updated the shelter's mission statement. It now read, "A place for those the world forgot, built by someone who remembers." He didn't need his old family's name anymore, but in the quiet work he did each day, he had unknowingly protected the very future they failed to love. Sometimes, legacies aren't inherited, they're built. And sometimes the family that cast you out ends up needing the light you left behind. Do you think forgiveness always needs words, or can action be enough? Follow us on Heartstorie to hear more untold truths from lives the world tried to erase but couldn't.